Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy that you're here. My name is Kerry Ford, and I'm the host of John McIntosh Q&A. What is really going on? Question mark, question mark, question mark. I'm happy to be here, and I'd like to welcome you and invite you as we go along to please put your comments, your suggestions, or your questions in the comments, the live comments section to the right of your screen. Let's see, we're going to keep this at about 55 minutes long as usual. And if you've missed some of our previous Q&As, you can watch them on John's YouTube channel, which he's going to pop up the link right now. It's Love Lines WG. There it is. So you can go back and watch those. And if you want to ask a question after you've viewed this live, you can email John. He loves to get email, believe me. And if your question is chosen for the next Q&A, you will be invited to ask your question live with us if you want to. So there's his email address. So just to introduce myself, as I said, my name is Kerry Ford. I live in Southern California, and I share my own insights and downloads about the shift, which is the time that we're in right now, on voiceofdivinefeminine.com, which is a website I put up a few months ago before all of this started to really happen. So you can email me through that website, voiceofdivinefeminine.com, and share your own insights, and we can form a connection that way. So most of you are probably very familiar with John McIntosh, but for those that may be new to him, I'm just going to read a very brief bio about John. John McIntosh was a successful entrepreneur until 1999. He traveled for decades around the world, speaking to tens of thousands of people about personal development before leaving everything behind and diving into self-discovery inquiry. John shares his acquired understanding of the false self-identity, with his personal experience of thinking with the heart, which returns you to full conscious awareness of who you really are, through his 27 books and daily blog articles. So he's just popped up a link to some of his books. And I guess that's about it on my end. I want to bring on John McIntosh, and he's going to speak to us a little before we get going. Hi, John.
Hi. Sorry, I'm taking you off there somehow, and I don't know why that happens, but anyway.
No problem.
Here I am.
There you are.
Okay, let me just take this off. There we go. Okay, you who are watching this today may or may not have seen the first three that we did, and it will be ongoing on Thursdays until further notice. But the title has to do with the great shift that's going on and what's really happening. And today's talk is about, or preamble is about manipulation of the dream, which is kind of a flow from the first preamble that I did on the first broadcast. Obviously, there is a major shift on the planet, notwithstanding the fact that the pandemic seems to be the most visible thing. And I'm touching on a little bit more each week before we get into the questions, if for no other reason, to help those that might be confused about what and why what's going on is going on. And I've talked a little bit about what I call the three awakening stages. The first one is the awakening from, you could call it the hypnosis of what the world has seemed to be for thousands of years, but certainly in each one's lifetime, in who's watching this, let's say in the last 100 years, you probably fit in there somewhere. And then the awakening that Muji has called Hollywood spirituality, which is a focus on trying to make your life better through spirituality. And then the real awakening is the awakening from the dream of who most people believe they are as a separated self. I call it the false self identity, or the body mind false self identity, or person that most people believe is who they really are. To the awareness of and the livingness of the self, in capital letters, which is another word for God, or consciousness, or I am, or love. Not the love that most people are aware of. Let's say, put it in capital letters. So those three, you might call them levels of awareness, are what are being highlighted in what we're talking about in these broadcasts. So just talking about the hypnosis related to what's going on in the world right now, I think that most people would probably agree. A lot of them, you, are scratching your head and saying, what the hell is all of this? This is crazy. I've never experienced anything like it before. Along with that, there seems to be what you might call an expose of what people may refer to as the elite, or the cabal, or now I think the current vernacular is deep state, which seems to be swirling around this American president. And whatever you may think of him, he certainly is in the vortex of what's going on in terms of exposing. When the light is turned up in a dark room, let's say a pitch dark room, you immediately see whatever furniture is there, whatever obstacles might be there, so you don't fall over. And most of us, most of the population of humanity for thousands of years have been tripping over obstacles in the world. We call them the challenges or the issues that you have since they were born. And as you become more aware, that is, as the light of awareness expands, you see more obstacles and likely you avoid them. And that's what's happening now, to put it quite simply. So the so-called perpetrators of nasty stuff that's been going on the planet, far nastier than most are aware of yet, are now starting to be visible. And you could say that these sleepers, because they're sleeping as well, are much deeper sleepers than most, because they fully buy into the dream, into the reality of the dream. And they are very cognizant of how to manipulate the dream. And I'll tell you very simply how to do it. I was extremely successful at it myself in business. I made millions of dollars doing exactly what I'm going to explain to you. And I taught thousands of people how to do this. It's not real, but it works in the dream in terms of manipulating the dream. I wrote a brief handbook that you might be interested in called From Magician to Master. It's a very quick read that summarizes a little bit of what I'm going to say. In order to create your reality, you've heard, well, what you think about, you become. Well, you don't become it, you experience it, because who you are is the self. And you don't become the self, you become aware of the self that you are. So that's a tiny shift in the explanation, but it's a huge shift in the understanding of it. In order to create something, you have an intention, whatever the intention is. It can be a very simple thing. I'm going to go shopping for groceries. And so you have an intention to go to the grocery store. You don't think about it very much. You've done it hundreds of times before, but that is an intention. And then you place your attention on that intention. And to the degree that there is a passion connected to it, a fire, life force, if you like, related to the intention and your attention of it, the likelihood of it manifesting in your experience, not your reality, because this is not reality, it's a dream. It's just a dream within the grand dream. It will 100% in most cases come to pass. Most people have a number of things that interfere with most of their intentions. Most intentions are as simple as getting in the car, driving to the grocery store, buying your groceries, coming home. Most intentions aren't that simple. They might come with starting a business, looking for the perfect mate, buying the right house in the right neighborhood, so-called right. It could have to do with trying to save the planet, which many people in the middle awakening stage get involved in. And so there are many obstacles, which is part of one's conditioning, that interfere with the attention on the intention. And those obstacles very often begin with unworthiness, which is at the very base of all conditioning. I'm not good enough. I don't know how to do this. I have all kinds of guilt, shame, and remorse associated with what I've done in my life, and so I don't deserve this. And so these things, usually unconsciously, interfere with why people do not achieve what they would like to achieve. They think, for example, I don't have enough education, I don't know the right people, so I can't accomplish what I really want to do, so I'll settle for XYZ, whatever it is. None of these things interfere with accomplishment at all. If your intention and your attention and your passion are pure, there is nothing that will interfere with the manifestation of what it is that you're trying to create. So, extrapolating that backwards to this group of beings that have been around for thousands of years, but are very, very intensely connected to one another through a network around the world, these deep sleepers, I'll call them, they know precisely how to do this. And they do it in various ways and means that are extremely focused. So their intentions generally come to fruition. And many, many things exist as a result of this focused, concentrated attention, passionate attention by several thousand people for hundreds of years, particularly the last 100 years, and exist now in a manifested form around the world as a network that you could call a hypnosis machine. You could call them shepherds because they're guiding the sheep, which is most of humanity, into various ways and means of living according to what they might call a one world government. Now remember, this is a dream. They are dreamers. What they're doing is creating more dreams. None of it's real. But it seems very real when you're still stuck in the idea that this is reality. So what I'm explaining to you is what has happened and is still happening and is now being broken down. And it's being broken down because, as I've said in previous broadcasts, we're shifting or have shifted out of the dysfunctional divine masculine patriarchy that's been dominating the planet for about 11,000 years. We've shifted out of it and into a neutral phase, call it the Age of Light, which is about 2,000 years. And therefore, the dominoes are falling. The house of cards that it is collapsing. And it makes a hell of a noise. You could call it a noise. A big drama is occurring around the world. The pandemic is intertwined with this, and the pandemic is not real at all. It's part of a gigantic scam connected to many other scams that are happening unknown to most of humanity. None of it's real. And the evidence is there for anyone that chooses to check. But I'm not encouraging you to do that. You can if you pull to it. I never encourage anyone to go into the mind because you'll get stuck there. You'll come up with great answers. You'll become very angry, and you'll get stuck there in the dream. What I'm encouraging people to do, and the reason that I write the articles that I do every day, and the reason I'm doing this, is to point to who you're not. And you're certainly not the mind. You're not the dream. You're not the dreamer. You are God. You are the self. And that's what my purpose is to illustrate this in the simplest possible terms so that anyone that is pulled to move in that direction, as I was in 1999, I'd been studying spirituality since 1976. I was very wealthy and I was extremely miserable. And I reached the line in the sand where I couldn't take it any longer. And I said, I choose freedom no matter what. I jumped off the cliff and I dove into self-discovery. And about 13 years later, I discovered who I was and have been living that way since about 2013. And so I'm just simply sharing the fact that this is possible now. It doesn't take you hundreds of lifetimes. It doesn't take you extreme um, disciplines and practices. You can do that if you wish, if you're pulled to that. It's not necessary. It's very simple. That doesn't mean it's easy. You have to stand in the fire of who you're not. And that means not placing your attention on the dream that's disintegrating on the planet right now, but placing your attention on you, on the real you. And I've already explained self-discovery slash self-inquiry slash surrender is the quickest way. And if you look in my my book page, you'll find a manual, a very brief manual on that as well. There are others. Ramana has an excellent one that's very short. It's a little more complicated, but it also explains self-inquiry, surrender very well. This is the direct route to freedom. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. What's going on right now is these manipulators that have been in power for thousands of years, intensely for the last 250 years, are now being exposed, and what they're doing is collapsing. They are also God. They're just sleeping more deeply. So this is not about finger pointing or bashing or getting even or any of that sort of thing, which certainly many people will be inclined to pursue. It's about becoming aware of what's not true and focusing on what is true, because if you place your attention on the truth, the self, the God you are, you will become aware of it, providing you're sincere and you're not just trying to make your physical life more comfortable. You will be shown exactly, precisely, every single moment of your experience. You'll be shown what to do, where to go, what to say, and who to say it to, and very often not saying anything. So let's just leave it at that, and I'll bring Anne back, and she will start with the first question.
All right. Wow. Okay. The first question is from Anonymous, and the question is, I have lately experienced a clear discernment between presence, truth, I am, and the mind's wants and desires. It's like everything drops and I just remain present where I am. My question then is, it is like my whole system just wants to be here where I am, but I have a plan to go travel in the next several days. I can see the movement of wanting to see this and that, this person and that person, but something in me just wants to stay where I am, and fall deeper into the truth of what I really am. I can see how fear arises. My whole system goes from relaxed to alert and so on. And I can see how all the triggers in me are linked to past trauma. I really cannot get ahead of this, because sometimes it is about facing the fear, taking action, and seeing it all blow up. And sometimes it's about listening and just staying where I am. I am sometimes, like now, very confused and don't know what to trust and act on. Can you help?
Absolutely. And thank you, Anne. This probably resonates with a lot of people as a question, not precisely perhaps, but I'm sure that many have felt this way. And when one begins to touch into presence, which is just another word for the self, resonates with the feeling of truth, probably periodically comes and goes, because conditioning is there. Conditioning then creates circumstances that pull you back into the mind, the false self environment of the dream. But more and more, as you focus more and more on the truth, you're pulled more and more into the presence of the self you are, who you really are. This is beyond description. You can call it bliss, but it's beyond even that word. And obviously, you want to stay there. But there are things that maybe you have to do. We need to clothe ourselves, feed ourselves, and have shelter. And that may involve, quote unquote, doing certain things. There may also be things that we, quote unquote, want to do, desire to do. That's for sure conditioning. But it's there. So we don't deny it. We say, yes, it's there. I feel I'd like to go here and I'd like to meet these people. So we look at this. And there may be a consternation about this, that I should be staying in this space or spaceless space of the self, because now I'm, you might say, getting it right. This is the way the mind speaks. But that's the mind complaining. That's the mind speaking subtly about guilt of not doing things right, or even thinking about not doing things the way they think is right, the way the mind thinks is right. You're never ever going to be guided it's what the Bible calls the blind leading the blind. You're never going to be guided anywhere except for into the ditch by the blind. So there's a very simple way to know where you should be, what you should do, what you should say, and to whom, or not say what I mean. And that is, if you feel joy about the, let's call it a thing that you are, I don't want to say want, but pulled, influenced, guided to do, then that is where you're supposed to be. Now, joy is not the same thing as happiness. Happiness is the handmaiden of sorrow, and it's a roller coaster. Up and down, up and down, up and down. Constantly during the day, you can go through a roller coaster of happiness and sorrow many times during the day, with sometimes some spikes of both. They're highly emotional, and emotions are tools of the mind. It's not who you are. It's an aspect of the dream that you seem to be an actor in, but you're not. You're the self cloaked in this disguise called a person. But joy is a flat line. And the flat line is always there. Joy is who you are. It's another word for love, another word for peace or beauty or God. And it can be and is present even in the presence of extreme pain, chronic pain. Lifelong chronic pain can exist in a person's life, but joy, when you're in the self, when you are aware of the self, is who you are. And you can experience joy even when your body, let's say, or your experiences are hellish. So, getting back to the question then, it doesn't matter where one is with regard to the self. The self is everywhere. Everything that seems to be happening is happening within the self. Self is not in you. You are in the self. And when I say you, I mean the false you, and I mean the false world, the world universe, all experiences, all history, everything that's happened in the dream is inside oneness, the self. There can't be anything but it, so there's no outside one. There's no outside the self. Everything is happening inside, a projection on the screen of consciousness called one, or the self. So if you are, in this case, pulled to go to this place or that place and meet this person or that place, and it feels, key here is it feels joyful. And joy very often is a very subtle, simple feeling of peace. It just kind of flows. And there may be a spike of happiness or excitement or exhilaration, but that's the mind. But in the midst of it, this sense of well-being, of joyfulness, is a pointer towards where you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to say, etc. So then it doesn't require that you sit in a lotus position, cloistered away in some room, and meditate frequently or all day, or whatever you think is, whatever the mind tells you you're supposed to do to get into this place or stay in this place of presence. It can be anywhere. It can be on the street. It can be doing your laundry. Or it can be out and about, visiting different places in the world, seeing friends. If you feel joyful, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And that can become your your gauge, if you like, for every moment of your conduct, everything that you do or don't do. If it feels joyful, you know you're in the right place. So hopefully that helps.
Wow, that was amazing. All right, the second question is from Michelle. And Michelle wants to know, well, she says, I watched the replay of your live on YouTube, and I wanted to thank you. Your explanation on conditioning and attachments made sense in a way that they never have before. I wonder if you could explain the experience of remaining as the self as you do. Is it more of a conscious awareness as the observer, and or is it a nonstop feeling of love, joy, freedom, peace?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This, quite frankly, is the mind wanting to know how and what. The mind is always looking for answers on these things. And it wants to put a frame around infinity. It likes to encapsulate things and put it in the safety deposit box of your life. It makes you feel safe to know what's coming, what could be, what is. The only way that what can answer this question can occur is to experience it. I can dance around the fire a little bit for you, but it's something that everyone will experience when they're there, and when they're there in an unbroken state. I can tell you that when you are living as the self and you're still in a physical body, because many leave their body. There's only a handful of people that are known, have a high profile around the world that are, you might call it, realized. Most of them are unknown. Most of them are cloistered away, never heard of them, never will hear of them, but they're in a physical body. If you're in a physical body and you are aware of who you are and you're living as it, so-called it, in an unbroken state, then you are aware that the world, universe, and all experiences and everything in it is a garment of you. It's temporary, it's constantly changing, constantly being born and dying, so it's not real, and yet there is a reality to it that is recognizable when you are aware of who you are. So you no longer say it's not real when you're aware of reality. That's absolutely not explainable. We may hear the Course in Miracles says nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. Well, what can be threatened? Well, anything that has a beginning and an ending can be threatened. So that's the entire universe. Everything in the universe can be threatened. So it's not real. And yet, when you are in the self, as the self, aware of the self, you know that everything is real. So it's a divine dichotomy. It's real in a totally different way, however. Even though it comes and goes, it's an expression, an extrapolation of who you are as the self. So when you look at the world universe, your little village or community or circumstances, you know unequivocally that this is you're looking at. So it's impossible not to love it. There is no such thing as judgment or hatred. There's no such thing as a hierarchy of goods and bads. Like I was talking about these characters that are manipulating the world and have been for a long time. I mean, some of them, people would say, "Oh, this is pure evil. These people are evil. They need to be, put up against the wall and shot, or worse." All this kind of stuff. This is just the mind talking about separation, talking about opposites, talking about, well, they're not me. Yes, they are. Everything that's happening is you, the real you. Everything. There's no exception. And of course, the dream is not happening any more than a movie happens. You don't condemn the bad guy in the movie when you walk out of the theater. You might feel a little uneasy for a while, but he may very well be the hero in the next movie. It's not real, and that's exactly what's happening in this world. So you look at the world as yourself, and you call it love. You don't really call it, but you feel love. You feel love for everything, every experience, every moment, everything, the ugliest thing you can think of, you love everything because it's you. So that's one small example. People can say, well, that's bliss. No, it's way beyond bliss. And even bliss is a mind-oriented, generated concept, and it's temporary, so it's not real either. The unbroken feeling of joy, which I like to use all the time, is what you feel about the world, even when you see something you don't like, something that is terrible. It doesn't mean to say that if you were placed, for example, I've used this example many times, you happen to be physically in the proximity of a child that's being abused, and you are pulled to intervene in some way. Then you intervene, and then you shake it off. You walk away and you shake it off. You don't judge the perpetrator or the victim, because there is no perpetrator and there is no victim. They're just actors in the dream, no matter how real it seemed. But you were pulled to intervene in that moment. You were there to do that. And then you let it go. You don't go out and start a movement, a cause, to stop this kind of thing. There are many people doing that, and that's fine. That's where they belong for the moment. You were there in the moment. You extended yourself, your love, to the love that you are, which was the so-called perpetrator and the so-called victim. You intervened in some way because you were supposed to in that moment. That was the destiny of them. And then you walked away. That's how a so-called master, the self, um, extends love to love, extends love to itself. So hopefully that gives you a partial answer to a very, very big question that'll be answered when you're there.
Wonderful. I just pulled this off of the live comments, so I'm going to insert it. It's from Sandra. I had to write very quickly, so
Go ahead.
Going to take a stab at it. She's taking an online course for a second time with Neil Donald Walsh. Mm-hmm. She says, I seem to awaken in the middle of the night. I sat up in bed only to observe a very gauzy body form descending from the ceiling down into the room, which I realized was myself. I calmly accepted this and laid back down to sleep. Can you explain what I witnessed? I feel like I came into the self at that time. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to tell you, that's not the self. That's just simply your astral body. It's the etheric version of you. People talk about higher self, lower self. There's no such thing. There is only the self. There is no higher self. My higher self. Well, who is this my that's talking about a higher self? Neither of these are just made up terms. There's no such thing as a soul. There is no such thing as anything except for the self. One is always one. It's not divisible into hierarchies of any kind. This is the hypnosis that occurs when one believes in separation and lives their life based on that. So all of these phenomenal psychic experiences, ET experiences, all of these things are just extensions of the dream. Even when you pass out of your body for good and into what's called the afterlife, you're still dreaming. It's just another dream. You're in a more subtle body, which is also a dream body, and experiencing whatever you experience there for minutes, hours, days, years, and then you come back into another physical body to take another kick at the can of waking up to who you really are. None of it's real. It's very exciting, especially if it happens to you. Some phenomenal thing happens. You have a psychic impression, a precognition of what's going to happen, and tomorrow it's front page news. This is very exciting. This makes you feel special. Or someone else has this ability, and they're able to tell you all kinds of things about your future. And now all of a sudden you're worshiping this psychic. So none of this is real, none of it. And what happens is it tends to capture your attention and take it away from what is real. and this is a distraction. It's part of your conditioning. Now, on the other hand, when you are expanding in your awareness of who you really are, you will begin to probably develop, and it's not really developing, you're just simply remembering aspects of abilities that you have. For example, precognition, or you might be able to hear things, or you might be able to see things. There are things, even more dramatic, far more dramatic. You might find yourself awake in your dreams. There are many, many numberless things, abilities that are possible within the dream as you become more and more aware of who you are. They are not making you in any way special. They just happen to be there because they resonate with your destiny. And everything is predestined except for the choice to be free. So your destiny then, if you like, requires this or that particular ability. Psychometry, for example. You pick up a shell on the beach, and all of a sudden you see the history of it. This is an ability related to time. Of course, time is not real. Space is not real. History is not real. It's a dream. But it can be useful. All of these things can be stepping stones, and you can take as many stepping stones as you like to bring you to the awareness of who you really are. Or you can just become aware. It depends on how frustrated you are with the dream. And if you become excited about the dream, you're having fun, you have aches and pains and problems and with this and that, but you're having fun with the dream. Lots of spiritual people say this. Then guess what? You're in a prison with velvet bars that you can't see. You're still in prison. And knock yourself out. That's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing right, nothing wrong with that. It's just part of your destiny. It's when you reach the stage where you've had enough. You don't care what you've got, what you don't have. I had everything. And I had some abilities that I don't talk about because they don't really matter. Just let them all go and say, I choose freedom no matter what. And then you're on the so-called fast track. And you'll find yourself remembering who you are extremely fast. But you also will find that your life becomes much more fiery because who you're not will show up like dominoes falling all over the place because you've said yes to truth. And so what's not true becomes exposed because the light of your awareness is expanding and exposing, just like the whole planet and humanity is experiencing now, exposing what's not true, which is an incredible blessing. Not very comfortable, but incredible blessing. So I'm not telling anyone to do anything. I never do that. I just point to who you're not. And who you're not is something floating down from the ceiling and calling it the self. That's definitely not the way it works. That's just an etheric representation, extension of the body-mind identity, which is not real.
All right. We're going to go to Justin's question.
I lost your sound, Anne.
You did? Test, test, test. Can you hear me now?
Not hearing you. Hopefully I'm being heard.
Yeah.
Maybe someone, one of the watchers can just verify that they can hear me and ideally hear you, but I can't hear you.
I can hear you.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
Well, I'm not sure why you can't hear me.
Okay, not sure what's going on there. Just check your see if your mute button is on in the bottom left.
No.
It's not on.
Can you hear me now?
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now? I
hear you now. Okay.
All right, I put my earbuds out. This might be the problem.
No.
I'm putting them aside.
Well, sorry for that, folks. Stuff happens.
Can you hear me now, John?
I hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. I was just about to read Justin's question, and here it is. Regarding the relationship with our own unique conditioning, do we bring most of it with us from previous lives? And what is the connection between it all and what happens in our early formative years? How much of it is learned from our childhood and parents, etc.?
Okay, so let's just say that you have this bundle of conditioning, which is attachments, expectations, identifications tied to memory, which is the past, and imagination, which is the future. None of these things are real, but this makes up the conditioning, and the conditioning, which is based on unworthiness, guilt, shame, and remorse, which is tied directly to the belief in separation. This then makes up the body, mind, false self, identity, person that most people believe they are. Most people, most beings, come into another physical body, which is a dream body, in the dream, with part of their conditioning, not all of it, because they're not ready to transmute, transform, dissolve all of it in that lifetime. That's their destiny. Let's say that that's the case for the vast majority of people throughout history. Many in this phase of clock time have come in with all their conditioning because they're ready to be free, because the light is expanding so quickly. They chose this moment. Those who were ready chose this moment to appear back in the dream planet called Earth. In order to, you could say, remember this conditioning, an environment needed to be scripted, if you like, that would be conducive to this remembrance. So, for example, I was born into a dysfunctional family, and I was the battered child, physically battered. I was the rebel. I was the black sheep in the family. I needed this because what it did, I'm just using myself as an example, an exact example, because I needed to feel I wasn't important. I needed to feel invisible. I needed to feel unwanted, unloved. And that then would register as an intention to solve that problem as I saw it then. And I didn't see it consciously. How did I solve it? I solved it by acting out. And that's why I was called a rebel. And as I grew older, I solved it by becoming an entrepreneur, so that I would be on the world stage in a visible form, and people would point at me and like me, just pay attention to me, because being invisible is far more painful than being told that you're a bad guy or a good guy, in whatever context. And so that is an example of how the conditioning that I had, which is started with unworthiness, was going to reappear in this lifetime, was through the environment of that family. You could call it an agreement with those beings prior to being so-called born. You're not born. The self is never born, never dies, but coming back into a physical body. It's not really an agreement. It's just part of destiny, and it's manifested for you out of your conditioning and theirs. And so it was the story or the play or the movie that was scripted for me and them to act out, in my case, for me, to look at this conditioning called I'm not worthy, so that it could eventually dissolve back into the self and disappear, which it did ultimately. So it's a blessing, and the more traumatic, the more dramatic and chaotic a person's life is, the more conditioning they are exposing their awareness to as an opportunity to transform or dissolve that conditioning, or who they're not, from their experience as a false self. So you could say that people that have really tough lives really have chosen to dissolve, give themselves the opportunity to. That doesn't mean they will. You can become bitter and angry and resistant, as many do, but it's the opportunity on a large scale to dissolve much of the conditioning that is part of the identity, the false identity that they've been wearing. And hopefully that helps.
All right, this question is from Ananda, and Ananda wants to say, there is something wanting to burst open from within. Is what I'm feeling a collective fear because there seems no reason for this? Or is it just the mind that's coming up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a much better question than the shortness of it. When someone, I happen to know this particular person is very sincere and devout in relationship to the self and freedom. So when someone is living the truth, is living as the self, perhaps not in clock time 24/7, as they say, but most of the clock time, they will very often be exposed to collective conditioning that's manifesting somewhere in the world. Doesn't have to be next to them, matters not. It's an energy that knows nothing about time and space, and become a source of transisting, shifting, diluting, in some cases dissolving that frequency. And this is why many of those that have realized that are living as the self and are totally unknown, which is the vast majority, totally unknown on the planet, living very often cloistered lives, are acting as transistors to step down and dissolve the collective conditioning of the planet. Now, let's just take a person, a specific example of a person who is not realized, but they live as the self a lot. It's like a beaker of water. If you can imagine a cylinder, 12 inches high or whatever, a third of a meter, of relatively clear water, not full to the top, let's say 3/4. And then you take another beaker which has muddy water in it, and you pour it into the beaker with the clear water. The beaker with the clear water is the person who's living mostly as the self. The person who, or the dirty water, is a collective energy of conditioning that's occurring on the planet. Not necessarily all of it, but part of it. When you pour it into clear water, obviously what happens is it gets, the dirty water gets diluted, and there is some, perhaps a lot, of clarity occurs as a result of the mixture of the two. That's exactly what's happening in the case of this individual and many individuals who are living mostly, you could say, in the light. Now, take it a step further to a person who lives as the self always. This would be the same beaker, except that it would be like a flood of pure water flowing through the beaker that has no bottom. It's a constant flow of water flowing through the beaker, and it's clear, it's pure. If you add to that mixture, which is not a mixture because there's nothing in it, that emptiness, the same dirty water, it'll just flood straight through it without touching the one who's living as the self for more than a moment. It'll still touch them; they'll feel it. And I know of a few people specifically that experience this on a regular basis, because this is what their purpose is. They'll be fine, and then all of a sudden they'll go through a spike where there's great discomfort, usually appears in the body somewhere, perhaps an experience, but usually it's in the body somewhere, and then it's gone. This is very common. But for a person who is still not completely living as the self, they may experience some discomfort for a prolonged period of time. They could get very sick for a prolonged period of time, but they've chosen to take on the transformation of some of this dysfunctional energy. And so that's what's happening for them.
Thank you. We had another question in the comments from Susan. So Susan wants to know, can you also speak into the quote unquote past lives journey that many go on and what they are in truth?
Okay. We're getting close to the end of the clock, so we'll make this the last question. Let's first of all be very clear that reincarnation and karma, which is basically just conditioning, people call it cause and effect, is not real. But in the dream, it is real. So it's a dream within a dream. And so past lives or lives of any kind, including the one that you're experiencing as you're listening to me and the body that I'm in right now, is not real. It's just a dream. But it is real in a way. So let's just talk about it as if it's real. The concept then of many past lives and possibly future lives, that one, people will call it a soul, but it's not. It's the self. There is only the self is wearing as a garment while it experiences the grand dream. And it's wearing it in a state of slumber, possibly partially awake, possibly completely asleep, like these individuals, these manipulators I was talking about at the beginning. But it's always the self, and it's only the self. There is only the self. There's no higher self. There's no soul, as I've said before. These are just garments on top of garments. There is only the self. One is always one, never divisible. This is a really excuse me, I lost my my headphone set. This is really a large point to get. And when you get it, when you recognize that there is only the self, then you're very clear that the dream is only a dream. So whatever past lives a person may have had, they were other opportunities for the self to awaken to itself. And the circumstances, whether they were a pauper or a king or queen, whether they were deformed or had a magnificent body, whether they were obscure and unknown or famous, or combination of all of these and limitless other possible combinations. These were all scenarios, like a movie, like a script on a stage play, where the conditioning was expressed and experienced as opportunities to recognize who they were not, who the self was not in those disguises. That's what they're for. They're also an opportunity for the self to taste and savor itself in the disguise of a world, universe, humanity, dogs, cats, birds, water, mountains, flowers, to experience itself. And it chose to do this in a state of unconsciousness of who it is, in order that the movie would be more enjoyable, like going to the movie before you read the book. You don't know what's coming. But when you've had enough, you could say enough incarnations, enough flack, enough difficulties, enough sorrow, enough pain, when you're tired of it, when you're fed up with it, that aspect of the self that is so-called incarnating over and over again in a body that seems to have a thread tied to a person called you that seems to have lived in previous lives, a string of people that you may remember in part. You may remember some of them, perhaps all of them. When it's fed up, it does what I did. It says, I've had enough. I choose freedom no matter what, in whatever language you use. And very quickly, it will awaken to who it really is. So the purpose of reincarnation is to experience the dream and also to awaken from the dream.
Thank you so much, John. That was wonderful. I want to mention that if you asked a question in the comments and we didn't get to it, I have written it down, and you will be invited to ask your question on next week's Q&A. You can do it live, or I can ask it for you. Or here's John's email address again. So feel free to write him an email and ask your question that way too, also.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. This is our fourth venture into the unknown. And we welcome you to come. So far, it's 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, wherever it is around the world, on Thursdays. And we welcome your questions and participation, and any ideas that you may have to change the technology. Just finish by saying what's behind me, as last week, is a green screen with a very nice looking environment, as you can see, just to accentuate the fact that I'm not really here and it's not really here and we're not really here, but we're here. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Lots of love. Bye for now.